It says error coins. We love when things go wrong, of course, and it's a talk for you and a talk for us tonight. And I mentioned the most important part of this screen is at the bottom where it says, if you have any questions anytime, just email me at minterrors@gmail.com, minterrors@gmail.com. And when I say email me anytime, don't be shy, please. I answer questions all day long from people far less perhaps qualified than you with whatever your level of numismatics is. People who are bare beginners write me all the time with questions about errors, and I'm always happy to hear from them, always happy to hear from people at all levels of the hobby. So if I can help in any way, let me know. So we have goals for today, and they're very simple. My goal for today is to describe the minting process and have you be able to tell perhaps how an error coin was made. And the way we're going to do that is sort of trial by fire. I'm going to describe the minting process because it's essential to understand the minting process so that we know where in the minting process something might have gone wrong. And then I'm going to show you examples of coins from my collection, and I'm going to pinpoint where in the minting process they might have gone wrong. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean in a minute. But first, we're going to break a rule. And here's what we're going to do. The number one rule of any PowerPoint presentation is don't put too many words on a slide. It's unbearable to see too many words on a slide. People don't want to watch a PowerPoint presentation where there's even one slide with too many words on the slide. So let's break that rule. This is a who, what, where, when, and why of mint errors. Who collects them and how can I get involved? Well, people collect mint errors from all strata of coins. I've met people who collect one mint error. Literally, they have one piece in their collection. I have met people who have one piece and that piece is a 5 or 6 figure coin. I've met people who have one piece in their collection and that's a single figure coin. I love that. I love when people get involved at any level of the hobby. And how you can get involved is by first off learning the minting process because an informed person is going to be a happy collector. And of course, you heard mentioned in my bio that I'm a board member of TAMS and of Koneka. Koneka is an error coin and variety coin club devoted to this lovely, fantastic section of our hobby. And you can find out more at konekaonline.org. So the what of errors and varieties. What are they? What is a variety and what's an error? I'm going to be focusing on error coins tonight. Now, varieties is when the design of a coin changes over the course of a run of that particular coin. Maybe it's something about the date. Maybe a numeral in the date is recut, or maybe feathers in the eagle's wings are recut or redesigned, and it affects a number of coins or perhaps the entire rest of the run of coins. That's a variety off the norm of what is to be expected of that coin and denomination. The coins that I'm most interested in are mint errors, things that are struck wrong, or that the planchet had something wrong with it, or that the die had something wrong with it. And we'll dive into that in just a minute. So where does one find them and how? Sometimes people roll hunt for error coins. That is a painstakingly long experience. Some people have the tenacity of cockroaches and they're willing to just dive in and just for the end of time, just look through rolls and rolls and rolls and rolls and thousands of dollars worth of coins to find errors and varieties. Bless their hearts. I tend to look on eBay at auctions from the major auction houses, from other dealers and other collectors. I find it's more fulfilling that way because you end up finding bigger, more interesting things. Bigger meaning more dramatic errors that wouldn't fit into a roll of coins. So, when have they been collected? Errors have been collected since coins started to be made. I have coins in my collection that are, I have a Corinthian stater from ancient Greece that's a brockage that someone set aside, and I'll explain what a brockage is in a bit, but someone set this error coin aside 2,000 years ago, thinking it was interesting, and now it exists in my hands. So errors have been set aside and found fascinating for thousands of years. So why do people collect error coins? Well, I can speak for myself. I like weird. I like unusual. It's one of the reasons that I'm involved with TAMS in the Token of Metal Society. I like counter stamps, US counter stamps, and they're unusual, they're different. And I love error coins because they're weird and they tend to be unique and fascinating and interesting. So let's dive in. We're going to talk tonight about planchet, die, and strike. And if in the midst of getting an appreciation of the minting process, you understand a bit more about planchet, die, and strike, how each of those is affected in the midst of the minting process, and what might go wrong with a planchet, what might go wrong with a die and what might go wrong when a coin is struck, then tonight is an immense success. So, with that in mind, let's look at this extraordinarily looking, complicated diagram that actually describes a relatively simple process, the minting process, how coins are made. In the upper left-hand corner, we show metal coil being brought in by a forklift. Of course, metal starts off in a blob or essentially a brick, and then it's rolled out thin. It's heated, superheated, and rolled out thin so that it creates this metal coil, essentially, a long strip. Imagine a strip of coins, the thickness of the coin that's going to be struck from that metal strip, the length of a football field. That is coiled up, it's brought by forklift, and then what you'll see, and let me see if I can you see if I'm circling that with my cursor there?
Yes.
Great. That's the metal coil there. That metal coil is brought over to a machine, and once on the machine, that metal coil is fed into a blanking press. And in that blanking press, gang punches essentially come down. And like cookie cutters, imagine cookie cutters, they start cutting out what are blanks from that planchet strip. They cut blanks out of that planchet strip. And those blanks, let me find my cursor again. There we go. Somewhere it's disappeared. Oh, there it is. Good. Those blanks fall onto this conveyor belt. And you can see an example of a blank here. It's been punched out of that planchet strip. Those blanks fall onto a conveyor belt. The extra planchet strip with the cookie cutter holes out of it is sent back and melted down and made into more planchet strip. And that metal coil, essentially, that starts the process over. But for these blanks that have been cut out, these blanks end up in what's called an annealing furnace, and they're basically heated there. They're heated, and then they're put into a quench tank, which basically gets them ready to be struck. They go through a washer and a dryer, and then an important process that'll come into play in a moment, an upsetting mill. And the upsetting mill essentially is a machine that has a slightly narrower diameter of the blank. And as the blank rolls through on its edge through the upsetting mill compresses that blank slightly and raises the rim around the edge. That's what gives our coins the rim that we know of around the edges of coins. That's what turns a blank into a planchet. And you'll see it's labeled here as planchet. Now it's got a raised rim around it. The raised rim does a couple things. It makes coins, of course, easier to stack. The raised rim also makes the strike come out a bit better. After the planchet is made, it goes into a stamping press. And we'll dive into that. And here's a little inspector, and he's doing his job, making sure that all the coins are properly stamped. However, sometimes they are not. And coins that are clearly found to be misstruck end up being detected through a machine called a waffler. And that, as you see here, destroys defective coins. And those defective coins are made into new coins and basically melted down, and they're brought back to be made into metal coil again. But the coins that made it through go to a counting machine, and then they go out into circulation. Now, I'm going to refer back to this diagram a number of times. You don't need to memorize everything I just said. In fact, we're going to refer to it all the time. In fact, you're going to see that diagram again to make it easy for you. This is something that didn't come up in my description just now. This is the collar. This is a third die, essentially. A die, of course, with the obverse of the coin, not always on the top, and a die that is the reverse design of the coin, not always on the bottom, come together to strike a coin. And when the coin is struck, it has the obverse design and the reverse design impressed into it. And the metal flows up into the die. And that's what creates the relief on our coins with the designs that we know. But what prevents that planchet when it's struck from splaying out like a pancake is the collar. So you can imagine the planchet resting inside of this collar, and then the dies come down, strike the coin, and or strike the planchet into a coin, and the coin is kept from splaying out like a pancake by the collar. Collars also contain reading, which is where our reading comes from. When the dies come together and they strike the coin, and the coin starts to splay out and is restrained by the collar, what makes the reading, if there's reading for this particular denomination inside that collar, the metal flow flows into those reeds inside the collar so that when the coin pops out of being struck, it has reading around the edge. I like to refer to that as a third die because there's some things that can go wrong with the collar, and we'll see in a bit what's going on there. So let's dive into some error coins. We'll take a look, and like I said, trial by fire. Don't expect to understand every single thing I'm saying. I promise in a few minutes it'll make a lot more sense. So what we have here is a 1958D Lincoln cent with what's called a blowhole. And this is not a hole that was put in afterwards by an excited 6-year-old with a hammer and a chisel. It's not anything that happened after the mint, and I can explain how we know in just a moment. This is something that happened, and remember I said we were going to look at planchet, die, or strike. This is something that happened in the planchet making phase of the coins. So if we go over to our diagram over here, imagine up here at the top where that metal coil is being fed into that blanking press. What happens if during the making of the metal coil, even before the making of the metal coil, the mixing of the metal, the preparation of the metal that was then rolled out to make that metal coil, what if there were imperfections in that metal? Well, those imperfections wouldn't have been caught when they made that giant bit of metal coil the length of a football field. Those imperfections would have ended up certainly in the metal coil. And when that metal coil was fed through the blanking press and those cookie cutters came down and cut out one of those blanks from that metal coil, it's a chance in a million, but this is exactly what happened here. Those cookie cutters cut a blank out of an area of that metal coil that had one of those imperfections in it. In fact, an imperfection that made its way all the way through the blank. It could have been, or through the metal coil in that exact spot. It could have been an air bubble. It could have been the metal mixed incorrectly or inefficiently. Whatever it might be, this coin managed to make its way through the entire minting process and was eventually struck as a coin. So this would be an example of a coin with a planchet defect. We call it, a blowhole, or struck on a defective planchet because it was during the planchet part of the planchet die strike that we're taking a look at that this error happened. So pretty cool example. And what I like to look for, and this is helpful if you're new to the hobby, what I like to look for when I'm looking for an error coin for my collection is eye appeal. Eye appeal, eye appeal, eye appeal. For some people, it's all about condition. They want the best condition for their set of Morgan dollars or standing Liberty quarters. They want coins that are chocolate brown, say, perfect AU for their Indian cents, whatever it might be that strikes your fancy. For me, it's all about eye appeal. If somebody who doesn't collect mint errors can look at a coin and go, wow, that's cool. That's the coin for my collection. That's what I like. So this one has that eye appeal of, wow, that's cool. So let's go into something that happened with the die. So we're going to go back just for a moment to our example over here, our diagram. And in the stamping press, I made mention of the fact that there's a die on the top and a die on the bottom. The die on the top, just for ease of conversation, let's say that has the obverse design, Lincoln's head. And let's say the die on the bottom of the striking process has the memorial. Uh, and here we go. This planchet is situated in the collar, which we just learned about. It's ready to be struck. But what the coin doesn't realize yet, what the planchet doesn't realize, is that the obverse die has had a piece of it break away. It happens. We're talking about a mechanical process, not a magical one in terms of the striking of coins. So when the die, after striking, say, hundreds of thousands of coins, maybe even more than that, less than that, what have you, if there's imperfections in the metal or the way that the die was prepared, dies can get weak. They can break. They can shatter even. They certainly can crack. You've heard of a die crack. Well, one of the most important things we're going to be hearing about in the next few minutes is metal flow. Metal flow is an indicator for us of how a coin was made and sometimes of the authenticity of an error. And in this case, imagine that top part that looks like a big blob. Imagine that being an area where the obverse die simply broke and that piece broke away. So when the die came down to strike the face of that coin, it didn't have the full design. It didn't have "We trust" of "In God We trust." It didn't have the top part of Lincoln's forehead. It was broken away. There was just empty space there. Well, what happens? Speaking in terms of physics, matter isn't going to be created or destroyed. It's going to flow somewhere and go somewhere. A blob didn't just appear on the surface of the coin. That is metal flow up into that empty space that was caused when the die broke. Coin is struck, Metal flows up into that empty space, and what we get is the effect of a blob essentially on the face of the coin. There's something that can tell us that this is an authentic error coin, aside from the fact that just by face value it looks like it. Look on the reverse where the weakness is at the bottom of the word cent, in CEN and especially, but also in the T. That weakness corresponds to where the metal flowed up into that die space, that broken die space on the obverse. There's really no way that you're going to fake that in any way other than leaving scrape marks. And that's going to tell you right then and there that somebody faked this coin, but they did not. There's no such marks there. That shows metal flow. It shows where metal flow flowed up into the space left by the broken obverse die, and therefore there just wasn't enough metal to fill in the reverse die's design. So this is something that we call a cud. It was a term that was coined, no pun intended, some 50, 60 years ago. We call these cuds when the die breaks away. And the cud that we see here is certainly an authentic one on a 1970S Lincoln cent. An example of something that goes wrong with the die. We have planchet, die, and strike. So this is another example of something that's gone wrong with a planchet. Not the die. This didn't have the die break away. This was a Jefferson. It is a Jefferson nickel, 1979 Jefferson nickel that was struck on a defective planchet. And once again, we see that the metal that made the planchet, it's made the blank in the planchet itself, wasn't correctly made. And when this coin was struck, you can see on the reverse over near the A in United States of America, the A in the second A in America, there's weakness that corresponds to where this coin simply didn't have enough metal to fill in the reverse design, but for a different reason. Rather than metal flowing up into the obverse die, when this planchet was made, when the blank was made and then became a planchet, it wasn't formed correctly. There wasn't enough of it. So when the coin was struck, that indentation you see at about 230 on the obverse was simply a void. And there wasn't enough force and pressure, therefore, for the obverse die to press down through the coin and press against that reverse die and fill in that A in America. Instead, there was weakness there. Another example of a planchet error. This Jefferson nickel struck on a defective planchet. And I'll pause after each coin. If anyone has any questions, feel free to dive in because I'm not monitoring the chat. But I wanted to jump into a coin that was a strike error. This is actually a combo. It's kind of a planchet and striking error. What we have here is a Jefferson nickel struck off center on what's called a straight clip planchet. And I put our diagram back up of our minting process. So over here in our minting process, when this metal coil is resting on that forklift, it has to have an end. I mean, everything's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. So imagine the beginning of the metal coil. What does the beginning of a metal coil at the mint look like? Well, it looks somewhat like, but not exactly like, a 90-ish, and I'll explain the ish in a while, degree angle. Imagine a planchet strip that's a rectangle essentially, and that rectangle is the leading edge of the planchet strip. The rest of the planchet strip, the metal coil, is going to make lots of blanks, but that leading edge is basically a straight edge all the way across. So what happens when that straight edge starts getting fed through and the gang punch comes down and starts punching out blanks? Well, in the case of this coin, it punched out a blank that was essentially cut out from the end of the planchet strip. So we call this a clip planchet, but a particular kind, an end of strip clip or a straight clip. Even though nothing was essentially clipped away from the coin, it was more the blank was cut from the end of the strip. So when that blank goes through the minting process and ends up between the dies, it's pretty easy to understand that the dies and the collar are not really going to work correctly. I mean, the collar is on a cam system. It comes down and up in between strikes. And when it comes down and a planchet lands in there and gets ready to be struck, it makes a lot of sense that a misshapen planchet might not land correctly between the dies. Therefore, this coin was struck off-center, which tells us that in addition to it being a planchet error, it's also a strike error, planchet, die, and strike. So that's a pretty neat example of a multi-error coin.
I have a quick question.
Please do, yeah.
At the point of the planchets getting struck. Um, is the planchet basically cold room temperature, or is it heated to some degree, or heated to a great degree, or
They're heated in order to be softened. That's that annealing furnace we talked about. They're heated to be softened, and that makes striking them easier. But they are gone through a washer and a dryer, so they might be heated a bit. That's a great technical question. That's the kind of question that I should know the answer to. I teach, co-teach with my friend John Miller, the ANA summer seminar class on minting errors and varieties, and we go in extreme detail. We kind of tag team back and forth with different phases of the minting process and talk about errors and varieties of all kinds. And that's the type of question that I write down, learn from, and have a specific answer for the next group that I speak to, but not tonight. So I can find out and let you know and send you an email afterwards. I'd be happy to. I don't know about superheated. Heated, yes, but I don't know how heated after the washing and drying process. Great question, though.
okay, thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. I love that. That's one thing about this too, is that I always like saying this, and I'm actually glad you asked that question because it lets me say this now, that at some point everybody's a beginner. And in this talk, people will know the minting process. Some will know what a brockage is. Some will know what a double strike is. Some won't know what a die crack is. Awesome. We are all constantly learning. And I know that John Miller and I last summer, when we were teaching at the ANA Summer Seminar, had some aha moments of things that each of us with 30 and 40 years in the error hobby hadn't learned yet. It was great. So always learning. That's part of the fun of the hobby, I think, no matter what we're interested in. So this is a cool coin. This is an example of a striking error. So the blank looks okay to me. The planchet certainly, right, looks okay to me. But what happened was, for some reason, when this coin was struck, it didn't situate correctly, and it ended up being struck twice. So what that means is that it was struck off center and flipped around, and then instead of being ejected, was struck again. This coin has some slight buckling to it, which speaks to the idea that it very well might have been struck twice at one time. Some of the presses that have been set up over time at the mint don't just have one pair of dies next to each other, or rather, they have one pair of dies corresponding to one another, but right next to that is a second pair of dies. Sometimes there were quad presses as well, where four sets of dies were striking coins all at once. And what might have happened here, I think, is what's called a saddle strike, meaning that the coin was struck by two sets of dies at once because it was laying under and across two separate sets of dies instead of sitting in a collar. It was literally sitting on top of the minting machinery in between two sets of dies that came down. That gave it the saddle looking effect, which gives it the name of saddle strike, but essentially a double strike, a coin that's been struck twice, an example of striking in the minting process.
Question.
Please, yes.
In that last slide, that looks so strange, and the overall shape is so bizarre that you'd think that that would have been caught somehow in later phases of the process.
Yep.
Uh, how does something like that get through into circulation?
Great question. Fantastic question. So there's a number of different ways. When coins came out of the mint, they used to come out, of course, in bags, $50 bags. My dad, who started collecting coins in 1949, tells me stories of going to the bank and getting bags of coins and finding amazing things in there, errors and otherwise. And just the idea of going to the bank for a $50 bag of coins and finding Indian cents in it has made me just out of my mind for the last few decades. But errors would have escaped in those. Errors also got out of the mint in ballistic bags, which are these giant, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pound bags of coins that come out, and they somehow escape detection. Errors are also helped out of the mint. And if you look in auction archives, which is a fascinating and amazing way to learn about error coins, I recommend Stax Bowers, great collections as well, and Heritage. You'll find fantastic examples of things which you wouldn't think should exist. I'm in my 50s, and I came up learning that, in errors that there were no proof mint errors. That's what everyone thought in the 1980s. In the early 1980s, everyone said, yeah, there's no proof mint errors. That'd be extraordinarily rare. Proof coins are struck so carefully. How could there be proof errors? Well, over time, there started to be proof errors that were known. And granted, some proof errors make sense, right? They would make it out of the mint in a proof set. A cud, like we just saw, certainly could make it out of the mint in a proof set. A clipped planchet might make it out of the mint in a proof set. But what about a coin like this? That wouldn't make it out of the
Yeah.
proof set. Well, And I'm glad you asked because I love being able to tell this next story, which is that one of the ways that proof errors got out of the mint in 1971, 72, 73 in San Francisco and some other years as well was that mint employees, and we can look at our diagram here. You see the forklift in the upper left corner of our minting diagram picture. Mint employees realized that forklifts, like any other car or other vehicle, need servicing every once in a while. They need oil changes. Well, there was an oil pan in the forklifts, and that oil pan with used oil in it was impenetrable to the naked eye, meaning you can't see through used oil because it's dark in color. So, what Mint employees were doing in 71, 72, 73 in San Francisco were doing these clandestine strikings of fantastical proof errors on quarters, on dollars, and on half dollars, and then putting them into the oil pan of the forklifts that were being used to drag around your metal coil around the mint. Well, you've got now a forklift with an oil pan, and the oil pan is filled with fantastical error coins. You go home at the end of your shift, you've got nothing to show as you go through the metal detector, you get away scot-free. Well, what happens when that forklift goes out for servicing? Well, conveniently, it goes to a servicing shop where your friend works. Your friend dumps out the oil pan, your friend takes the error coins out of that oil pan, replaces it with nice fresh oil, and does whatever one does when servicing a forklift. Forklift goes back to the mint, and now what you've got is a shiny new, perfectly oiled forklift, and with your Confederate, a whole tray of soon to be very expensive proof error coins. So that's another way they got out of the mint. This one did not come out in a forklift in some exciting spy novel type scenario like I just described. Probably got out of the mint in a mint bag. I would expect in a bag somehow, giant ballistic bag, and someone found it in an accounting room at Brinks or something like that at a major bank institutional accounting room probably. Hard to say, really hard to say. Case in point, this next piece. So this is
Can I ask a question about those proof errors though?
please, yeah, I love
Are
talking.
they legal to own?
Awesome question. I love when I talk to smart people. That's great. Okay, so yes, they are legal to own. They have been deemed legal to own, but for a long time, no one really knew. And the Secret Service was being coy and or explicit at times saying they would confiscate error coins. People weren't sure if they were legal to own. And this goes back a long way, not just with the proofs, but with error coins. I found an example, the earliest known article that I found on error coins from the numismatist from around 1921 or so references a magazine that was printed in Kansas around the same time. And there's an article in there about a man who had a collection of bad coins, as they called them, and said that the mint wanted their bad coins back and wanted to pass a law to make the ownership of bad coins illegal. Well, what were bad coins? The article explains that some of them don't look quite right and that they weren't struck correctly. They didn't even know what to call them because no one had identified them yet, really. So there have been people collecting these things, but also questions about their ownership for quite some time. That's why when I was growing up and I'm 10 years old and I'm reading coin magazines and everyone's saying, oh yeah, there's no proof errors. It was two things. One, lots of people, including me, didn't think there were any because we hadn't seen any. But the other thing people were doing, people who owned them were probably telling folks, hey, write about the fact that there's none of these things to get the feds off our back so they let us keep our coin collections ultimately. Just in case anybody was feeling that heat or worried about pressure. Ultimately, it was a PR campaign to make people think there weren't any proof errors. And over time, the Secret Service decided, yep, okay, they're legal to own, and now voila, miracle of miracles, the joys of capitalism. Now people are trying to sell their coins, and they are successfully selling dramatic and fantastic proof error coins. Of which I've bought at least one. So no, there's a proof error coin coming up in the presentation in a little bit. That's pretty interesting. That would have made it out in a mint in a proof set. But yeah, that's the basics.
And I can relate in 1970 doing a floor tour at the Denver Mint and watching. In those days they had, after the coins were struck and they went into a bin, and then they went through shakers to things that were too large to be separated out, things that were too small to be separated out. But depending upon how they shook, they could fall through the sorters. And then they went on to conveyor belts, and they went past people who stood looking for error coins, but watching them, when they saw something that looked abnormal, they would pick it up and look at it. And like Lucille Ball in the candy shop, while they were looking at one piece, maybe 100 pieces would go past them, and you would see an error go past, and they would end up into a bag. And so those would be a legal thing because they left the mint and were distributed to the banks. It was not a foolproof process.
I love, love, love that story because I missed that in 1971. I wasn't old enough to go. I'm going to take that up with my parents. Why, at the age of 1, did they not bring me to the mint to see what you saw? I'm upset with them now. But the point more is that I've never heard that story before. It makes perfect sense. I absolutely believe it, and I can't wait to retell it and credit you. That's the type of story when somebody asks me in the future, how did these things get out of the mint? I can say, well, in 1971, this is an eyewitness account. I love it. Like I said, always, always learning. Thank you for
It
that.
was a second ANA seminar, and in those days, we were still allowed. It was a small enough group down on the floor, and we had an error specialist with us asking questions of the press operator. He stopped the press. He pointed to the bin of blank planchets ready to go in, the bin where the discards were going, and he told the error specialist, pick up planchets, put them on the press, and hit a strike and try to make whatever you want to make. And we stood and watched saddle strikes and all of that kind of stuff happen one at a time with an error specialist asking the questions. Nowadays, you can't do that anymore.
You can't. That might be my favorite story. You've made my week. I love that so, so much. I wonder who the error specialist was. We're gonna have to figure that out. That's interesting.
It would have been 71. It might have been Bob Fritsch. I don't remember now. You know, I was 20 years old, so that was a long time ago.
Man, okay. And you know, when my mom and dad watched the recording this video, why? Why didn't you bring me to Denver when I was 1? Amazing story. I love, love, love that story. I appreciate it so much. It's fantastic. It's so cool. So the coin on screen right now is what happens when a coin is struck so many times, or rather, a coin is struck, and then instead of being ejected from between the dies, another blank or another planchet comes in and is struck with that first coin on top of each other like a sandwich. And then maybe another coin comes in because they don't get ejected because that sandwich is wrapped around the obverse die and comes down again. And eventually a number of planchets have been struck at once. Imagine just layers like an Oreo, essentially like that. Well, the outer periphery of that multi-struck bonded group of planchets is eventually going to get weak and break apart. And what you're seeing here is as the old annex holder says, bonded multi-struck fragment. Basically, this is a fragment from a multi-struck group of coins that was between the die, so a striking error. How did that get out of the mint? Well, I'll have you know that in 1971 in Denver, anyway, this is a good question, right? Perfect example of how something like that could have gotten out of the mint is the story that we just heard. And I love that. It informs a lot about how that could have gotten out. So this is an example of something going wrong with the planchet. You see on the reverse there, the metal was mixed incorrectly. This is a lamination, a peeling up of the metal caused by impurities in the metal, causing it to essentially flake off the surface of the coin. This one's still attached. Sometimes laminations flake off, but an example of what can go wrong with a planchet. This one is somewhat like what we saw before, off center with a clip, but this coin was clipped twice. So when our metal strip is going through those gang punches, the cookie cutters that are cutting out the blanks, what happens if either a blank flips up in the air and lands on that metal strip as it's still going through between the gang punches, it might get cut again, maybe only partially as those cookie cutter punches come together, and that would cut out a crescent clip, as we call these. Another thing that can go wrong is that as that metal strip is being pushed through the gang punches, those punches can come down. What happens if when they come back up before their next blow, what if the strip doesn't advance correctly? Well, you're going to get one of those holes is essentially going to be cut again, in essence, right? You're going to end up with a piece of the metal strip that itself has a crescent cut from it. And that happened twice here. Again, that coin situated itself incorrectly in the collar and was struck off center. It's kind of a cool coin. People call these mushroom strikes, but mushrooms have nothing to do with them other than their look. This was a coin that tells us a little bit about our collar that we mentioned earlier and what can go wrong with it. I mentioned that if the collar is not in place and the dies come together and a coin is struck, that coin can splay out like a pancake. Well, ignore for a second that area at the bottom of the obverse of the coin. Look instead from about, I'd say, 8 o'clock to about 4 o'clock on the obverse, and you'll see the wide, essentially, the wide area where the rim should be. The planchet was situated in a in between dies with a collar that wasn't in place correctly to restrain it. So when the dies came together and struck that coin, it splayed out like a pancake. We call it a broad strike. In this particular instance, there was something else resting on the coin, another struck coin, perhaps a blank, and that's what accounts for that area at the bottom. And the pressure of the two pieces being between the dies at once, the coin intended that eventually became the broad strike, and whatever was resting on it caused that planchet to split because, of course, the dies are set for a certain pressure for one planchet in being in between them, not two. So that's what caused that coin to split. An example of a striking error. This one's real technical. I gotta make mention of it because it's ridiculously rare. This is called a rolling fold. It's the only example I've ever owned. I bought it this last year, and it's not an expensive coin at all, even though it's extraordinarily rare. You know, I've been talking a lot about the gang punches, punching out holes in the planchet, in the metal strip in order to create the blanks. Well, I've also talked about, if you remember, a cud, which is when a piece of the die breaks away, and then when the die comes down to strike a coin, there's space left where that break was. Okay, let's imagine for a second that in that blanking press, one of the gang punches that's about to cut out one of those blanks. What if the cutting edge of one of those gang punches broke away? What you'd end up with is a blank, and in the area that was broken from the gang punch, you'd end up with metal that was basically like a barb sticking up because the blank wasn't cut correctly by that gang punch because it itself had lost part of its cutting edge. Well, that barb that was sticking up on this particular coin, when this coin was struck, folded over and was struck essentially into the face of the coin. So you've got that rolling fold. This is an error type that was only discovered, I'd say, in the 1990s or 2000s, and everyone went wild looking for an example. And there's been few of them found. This one's particularly nice, and I went kind of nuts when I saw it. So let's see here. I'm going to go through a few of these just so you, because you're getting the idea now, I would expect. Off center, and once again with another coin. The colors on this are wrong. Ignore the colors. That was my my phone when I took the picture and the lighting. But you see in 1993 cent struck off center, which we've learned about, with another coin resting on top of the obverse, in between the obverse die and the planchet when the coin was struck. So off center with what we call a partial brockage or an indent, depending on whether or not it was a struck coin or a blank that was resting on top of there. This is an example of a cud, as we heard about earlier. And once again, where the word dime is on the reverse, you see that telltale area where there wasn't enough metal to flow into the obverse of or the reverse design and strike up the design fully. I love this particular example because people I bought this last summer during summer seminar, literally in class. And what happened was a young numismatist asked, "Where do I find error coins?" And I said, "Well, you can look on eBay." And he asked, "Well, what do I type in?" I said, "Well, you can type in error coin. If you want to, you can type in expensive error coin. You know, to your heart's content, you can type in whatever you like." I said, "But you have to type in something. Start somewhere. Get creative. You never know what you're going to find." And it wasn't that he was skeptical, but he just was unsure about what to type. And as we talked, I pulled out my phone as we were talking, and on eBay, I typed in weird blob dime. I don't know. I just tried it. Weird blob dime. And somebody had posted a dime with a weird blob on it. And this is that coin. I literally bought it as I was sitting in class in front of this young guy. I turned my phone around. I said, "Here's what I just did. I searched weird blob dime, and this is what I just bought. If I can do it, you can do it. I'm not a genius. Weird blob dime is something a 6-year-old could come up with, but you can do it. So let's go." So it was really an inspiring moment. And error coins are out there waiting to be collected, and they're available to us. So that was a fun one. An off-center cent, kind of a nice example, 1937 with some detail to it. A striking error, struck incorrectly by the dies. This one's interesting. This is a 1972 quarter that was missing part of a clad layer, meaning that impurities in the metal, essentially somewhat like a lamination, but part of its clad layer was missing when the coin was struck. Sometimes you get these with a full clad layer missing, and they're going to have that copper look to the entire side of a coin. I like this example just because it's visually interesting, and it certainly has that visually interesting element on the reverse where you see the cladding, the normal cladding in where America is struck normally, and the rest of the coin has a slightly mushy look to it because there was a little less metal there, and it was struck on a partial clad layer missing reverse quarter. There's something going on at the date too. I need to take a closer look at that coin to see if it's damage or something related to the minting process, but there you go. This one, once again, we would know what that was if I put the test to you. Off center with a clip, 1988 P nickel. This is a cool one. So in the minting process, when that metal coil is made and brought in by those forklifts that have new oil changes, that metal coil before it's rolled up, sometimes after it's rolled up, is scrubbed to make sure that there's no impurities resting on the metal, any rust, any scaling, anything like that. And they're scrubbed with wire brushes. And these wire brushes, of course, have brush bristles. So every once in a while, one of those brush bristles will land on the surface of that metal coil, and it'll land on the surface of a blank, or maybe it'll end up somewhere else in the minting process and get struck into the face of the coins. This is a 1969D Kennedy half dollar with a wire brush bristle struck into and retained in the face of the coin. I have a wild affinity for coins struck through wire brush bristles, and I'm really particular about them. As you can imagine, brush bristles would get bent and twisted, and you see them sometimes struck into the surface of coins because there's a lot of brush bristles in the world. Not a lot of these error coins. These are certainly quite rare. But my specifics about them is that the brush bristle retains its staple-looking shape, even though they're not technically staples. But I love these things, and when I can find them, and they're few and far between, I collect them when the staple shape is still intact with that brush bristle. But an example of a strike error, struck through a wire brush bristle that was retained in the obverse of the coin. This one is a really neat one. This is a coin that it has the look of that saddle strike that we saw before, where two sets of dies came down at once, but the dies aren't placed this close together. So what this tells us is that this coin was struck twice, 1971 in Denver. What makes this coin particularly interesting is that it was struck on a blank intended for a dime planchet. So this is a nickel double struck on a dime planchet. And how might that happen? Well, when those blanks are made, let's go back there we go, to our minting process here. When blanks are made, we see here a conveyor belt that brings them to the annealing furnace. But at different times in the history of the mint, blanks were put into tote bins. In fact, today they're put into tote bins. These tote bins have a little lip around the bottom, and I think also at the top, but certainly at the bottom, a little lip essentially where in the construction of the tote bin. So let's say it's 1971, we're in Denver, we're making blanks for dimes. We fill up a tote bin with blanks of dimes. We wheel it over to the dime minting process, as it were, and we dump out that tote bin. Well, what if in that little lip, the little edge inside that tote bin, a blank for a dime got stuck? Great. So now we've got an empty, in air quotes, tote bin with one dime blank in the edge of that lip. That same tote bin is brought back, and let's say the coin next up is Jefferson Nickels. So all of a sudden now we start cutting out blanks for Jefferson Nickels. We fill up the tote bin that is quote unquote empty, but really has one dime blank kind of wedged in there. Well, in dumping thousands and thousands and thousands of blanks into this tote bin, that dime blank gets dislodged. So now we wheel this tote bin over to the Jefferson nickel process, and we dump out these blanks. Well, we dump out an entire bin of Jefferson nickel blanks and one dime blank. And that dime blank ends up being struck twice because it doesn't situate correctly in the collar, struck twice by Jefferson nickel dies. And that's where you get this coin. I saw this at a show last year and did backflips and bought it right away. I think it's spectacular and always a really great conversation piece about the minting process. And it also speaks to the fact that we're always learning. I mentioned that John Miller and I, even the instructors of the ANA summer seminar, as prestigious as that might sound, learn new things all the time. And last year, while touring the aforementioned Denver Mint, we noticed that the tote bins and the dies, meaning the machinery containing the dies, were color coded. So you'd have a color coded sign or mark on the die on the machinery with the dies, let's say yellow, and the tote bin that was bringing blanks to that piece of machinery, planchets, bringing planchets over, was color coded with a color code that matched the dies. So that made sure that the blanks you were pouring into the machine matched that denomination, that with the intention of being struck. And we were like, whoa, we asked a question like, why is this color coded? And no one else cared, but John and I were freaking out. And the Mint employee told us, and we went berserk. So we learned something new. That's a way that they're preventing errors from happening. And while I wish they would stop doing that because I like error coins, it makes perfect sense. If you're in quality control, people like me are like a mosquito or a gnat buzzing in your ear. But that's what we like to collect. So that's one of their mechanisms to help stop that process. Just in case anyone wasn't clear on the collar, this is an 1864 cent that was struck out of collar. So you can see here that it was struck in a way that the collar wasn't in place, and this coin splayed out like a pancake. So one other piece of the minting process, I made mention before that when the metal coil is being fed into those gang punches, I kind of was, it's 90 degrees, but kind of not really. If you were to watch this again, you'd see me hem and haw a little bit. There's a reason. That metal coil would be really tough to put into that planchet cutting machine if it was indeed exactly squared off as a rectangle at 90 degrees. So the Mint cuts off a little bit of the leading edge of that metal coil at 120 degree angles. So at the leading edge of any metal planchet strip, any blank, the strip of metal coil, there's a 120 degree angle at either side of that leading edge. So when that leading edge goes in between those gang punches and planchets are cut out, there is a chance, albeit excruciatingly rare, that a blank could be cut from the 180 degree corner of that metal strip. This is called a corner clip. It is the one error type that I don't currently own. If anyone watching this has a corner clip for sale, sell it to me. This is not in my collection. A very good friend of mine also didn't have a corner clip example. One came up for sale. He had his eye on it, and I didn't want to buy it out from under him. Instead, I bought it for him, and he paid me back later. It was a very honorable thing to do. I'm extremely nice and also jealous of his corner clip. So yeah, this is a corner clip. They're very, very rare. They come up for sale very infrequently, and rarely with this look to it. This one's kind of off center. You can see on the reverse, it's got the corner clip look. There's a couple scratches to it. There's some struck through kind of rust on the back. I'm kind of in love with this thing, and I'm glad my friend owns it. So he gets to enjoy it, and so does anybody who listens to me speak. So
Greg, I have a question, please.
please, yeah.
Hi, this is Mike. Can you go back to the collar, one
Mhm.
slide back?
Mhm.
So it's hard for me to conceive of how a coin could be struck out of collar. I have several of them. They're great coins, but I'm trying to think how that would actually go down in the mint. How could it be struck out of the collar?
Yeah, so what happens is when a planchet is in between the dies, there's a cam system that kind of raises up the mechanism so that when the coin is struck, it's struck correctly. When that collar comes down, if a coin is resting on top of the collar, say, it is then out of, not within the confines of the collar. If it's struck, say, almost imagine it like above the collar, because the collar hasn't come up on its cam system at that point. So that's
Oh,
how,
okay.
yeah, if that makes sense, that's how it's struck out of collar.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. I don't know if I mentioned the next coin. It's a corner clip. And if you own one, sell it to me. Anyway, so yeah, the corner clip, one of my favorite coins. I love it. So this is just another defective blank. We saw an example of it earlier. This was just a neat example, just visually kind of odd, the way that defect in the planchet is situated in the design. This is a triple struck cent. We saw a double struck example before, but imagine the main strike, 1979 here. That was the first strike, and then two strikes off center, not saddle struck, but off center here. Pretty interesting. And in fact, there were blanks resting underneath each of those second strikes when they were made. We can tell that because the design on the reverse didn't strike through for those second and third strikes. It's distorted because it was a blank resting over the reverse die. So, yeah, triple struck cent, an example of a striking error. It's a personal favorite of mine. This is a piece of scrap. We call them bow ties. When the coin was when the blank was cut from the metal coil. This is something that can happen. You get these dramatic clips, and then of course that's not going to situate correctly between the die. To find an example with a date, a full date, is bonkers. I've had this for quite a long time. I was probably a teenager when I bought it, and pretty excited about it. So off center, struck on what we call a bow tie clip. I've got just a couple slides left. The aforementioned proof error. This is a proof dollar coin that was struck through a crescent-shaped piece of metal, manganese, that was itself already struck once. So imagine that thin crescent being struck once and then landing on an incoming planchet and getting struck again and embedded into that planchet. These two fit together as a mated pair. And that made it out most likely in a proof set where somebody noticed it was weird, probably broke it out of that proof set. It then came apart. They didn't know what to do with it. They probably got it slabbed or brought it into a coin dealer, and through time, that's gone to, I think, all the major error dealers of the last bunch of years, bunch of decades, and ended up in my collection. So I'm pretty happy about it. There's only a couple known examples. If you're looking and curious, and you're watching this tonight or watching it in the next little while, there's an example on Great Collections right now that's still embedded, crescent piece like that, embedded into the obverse of a dollar coin, a proof dollar. So look on Great Collections archives if you're watching this after the fact, and you'll see, I think it's a Chester Arthur dollar that a friend of mine owns that's selling it right now. This is a Canadian quarter struck on a dime blank. So that would be, again, an example of a dime making it in between the dies for a quarter. This is a personal favorite of mine, a Liberty nickel that was struck on a defective blank that broke apart in time. If there's impurities in the metal, they're going to eventually, cause a failure. Not necessarily. I mean, there might be pocket change in your pocket now, struck on defective blanks that isn't going to break in half. But this one, made in 1910, eventually did. And thank you to the human being, storekeeper, whoever it might have been. Let's call them a barber in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1911, who pulled this out of change and it broke apart in his hand. And he kept it aside until I got to buy it. So yeah, I like this thing. It's pretty neat, pretty dramatic. Two different pieces. This is one of the first error coins I ever bought. This is a Liberty nickel that was struck on a blank intended for an Indian cent. There's a really fun story behind this. It was around 1981. I was, I think, 10 years old. This is one of the first error coins I purchased. There was a flea market where I grew up in Woodbury, Connecticut. And there was a man who set up at the flea market, and he sold antiquities and axe heads and odd pieces of metal from different pieces of machinery and old, different things, just different curiosities and whatnot. And I had been interested in errors because I'd bought another minor error coin, somewhat minor error coin, for very little money, a couple dollars, at that same flea market a few months before, and had been reading fanatically about errors. Well, I walked up to this guy's case. We called him the tall, skinny guy. He was both tall and skinny. I walked up to the tall, skinny guy to look at his antiquities just because I thought they were curious. And in the case was this. And I knew what it was right away. And I asked him how much it was. And if I'm remembering correctly, I usually have the number right in my mind. I think he said it was $160 or $110 or $100 and something dollars. I've written about it, and if you find one of my articles with the story, the exact number is in there. Whatever it was, he might have said $1 million. It was like all the money in the world. I was 10 years old. I had like $4, So I told my parents, I said, I have to own this. I'll do anything it takes. I will wash dishes and wash cars and mow lawns for the rest of my life. And they agreed because they had a feeling that I knew what I was talking about. And the next week we went back to the tall, skinny guy and they bought me this coin and I paid them back out of allowances. I just paid it off last week. Whatever, whatever it was, the $150, 200, 120, it was all the money in the world, like I said. So the reason this story is even more interesting is because the coin is worth considerably more. And soon thereafter, in the 80s, certainly, error coin collecting became very popular. And this coin became worth considerably more. My father was walking around a flea market on the East Coast about 12 years ago or so, and he runs into the tall, skinny guy. I mean, this is decades later. And he walks up to the tall, skinny guy and he says, "Hey, I don't know if you remember me. My son and I used to come to the Woodbury flea market." He didn't even get the sentence out of his mouth. And the tall, skinny guy says, "Does your son still have that error coin I sold him?" Like, remembered it after decades and decades and decades. Amazing story. And I'm really happy to have it in my collection. So, yeah, and it's encapsulated. You can see there by PCGS. Um, Last couple slides. This is the crown jewel of my collection. I always wanted a coin struck on a washer. There have been about 15 times in the history of US federal coinage that coins have been struck on washers. We've been talking about machinery all night long. Machinery is held together with screws and fasteners that are somehow and sometimes held in place with washers. Those washers can fall out. They can fall into the machinery. They look like blanks or planchets. They can be struck into coins. It's happened about 15 times or so in the history of US federal coinage. So you get coins struck on washers from time to time. They're very rare. They're very few and far between. They're certainly not inexpensive items. And only twice in the history of our federal coinage have we had examples of a coin with a washer resting on the planchet when the dies came together, essentially embedding that washer into the coin, which is what happened here. The other known example is a steel washer that was embedded into a quarter. So visually, no offense to the owner, whoever they might be, it's not as visually arresting as this one, which with the composition of the washer, it contrasts with the copper of the cent. This is just a monster of an error coin, and every time I look at it, I get happy. And it's a cent, an example of a striking error, struck through a washer that is embedded in the coin, and the coin weighs appropriately, meaning it weighs cent weight plus what a steel washer would weigh. So pretty rare. Not gonna see another for a while. And then this is the last example that I have to show you, and then we'll call it good. This is a really interesting story. This got written up in the numismatist or in numismatic news. I'm sorry, in numismatic news. It's a discovery mated pair that I discovered purchasing it in an auction a couple years ago. People ask where coins, error coins can be found. They can be found in auctions, and sometimes the auctioneers miss what these are. And these were slabbed. And the slabbing company that I'll just let remain unnamed and the auction company that I'll let remain unnamed both missed what this was. This is a mated pair where coin one, you see at the top, the obverse and the reverse, was resting on top of coin two when they were struck together. The grading company called it mated pair coin one for one coin and mated pair coin two for the other coin. The auction company taking what it said on the slab, because of course we always appreciate what it says on the slab. We don't ever pay attention to the coin itself. I'm being facetious and ridiculous. We always should pay attention to the coin, not what it says on the slab. The auction company just repeated what the slab said. And in an auction, a major auction of almost all errors that all collectors from around the world who collect major errors were looking at, the auction company put shield nickel mated pair coin one and two. Okay, well, I took a look at it, and having been around since the dawn of time and errors, I know one thing. There's no mated pairs of shield nickels. They are unknown. I've never seen another example of a mated pair of shield nickels, meaning two coins, mated pair, struck together as an error at the same time. There are no mated pairs of shield nickels, at least as far as I knew. But also, this one had a weird look to it. And what's weird about it is that if you look on the reverse of coin two, there's some design up here. And that design is the denticles or the dentals that you wouldn't expect if two planchets that were for the same denomination, shield nickels, were resting on top of each other. Well, if they're resting on top of each other and they weren't splayed out with the collar out of place, how could it be that we would see design showing through? In fact, there should be no design showing through if the planchets were the same size. And I thought to myself, what if one of those planchets was actually smaller than the other? So this is just another example showing how the coins were actually resting on top of each other. And you can see here where there's a little bit of that periphery, the dentals up at the top and the upper right there, that's not there, that actually shows up here. And I thought, what if that first coin, coin one, wasn't on a nickel planchet? So I bought it, and I sent it in for regrading. And I talked to the grading company about it. And this grading company graded it correctly. And this may or may not be the grading company that graded it before. As I said, I won't mention that. But what I will mention is that NGC here called it right. 1867, no raise, mint error. The first coin struck on a 3-cent nickel planchet, and that was struck while resting on top of coin two, which is a coin that was planchet intended for and was a shield nickel planchet. So a 3-cent nickel planchet and a shield nickel planchet struck together at the same time. The rarity level is beyond comprehension. There are 2 examples of multi-denominational mated pairs known in the history of U.S. coinage. It just doesn't happen. Certainly not in MS-64. This is of the 2 coins. The other one has a greater variance in the denominations, but this is higher graded. You know, whatever floats your proverbial boat. Extraordinarily rare. When news broke about it, my friends called it the cherry pick of the century, and it certainly made it on the front cover of Numismatic News. You can look that up. I know that I wrote about it in Koneka's Error Scope magazine. You can find that as well. The Newman Numismatic portal sponsored a video to be made about this mated pair. That's available on the Newman Numismatic portal. You may have heard mention in my introduction that I do interviews for them. There's a video about this particular pair of errors that I narrate and sort of walk you through its how it was made, that was produced. Pretty cool, pretty exciting, and pretty fun. So that brings us.
Mint sport?
Pardon?
Was that mint sport? Did someone do it on purpose, do you think?
Great question. I mean, it's put it this way: if I was sitting at the mint and it's 1867 and I'm striking coins day in and day out, I would last about 4 minutes until I started making my own things. Great. I guess I'm never getting a job now at the mint in the 1860s. I can imagine that somebody got bored and made it, for sport. However, it is conceivable that it might have made it out of the mint normally. And here's why. When these 2 coins are together, they look like a nickel. And it very well might have been that it was made not clandestine in a clandestine way and not for mint sport. It could have been, it very well might have been that this coin got out of the mint through normal legal channels. And then at some point, after being in somebody's pocket, somebody's hand, somebody's collection, who knows, came apart. Because when coins are struck, they're bonded together with some force sometimes. And if not bonded, they're at least impressed, if they're like this, into one another. But eventually through jostling, they might have just come apart. So who knows? Good question. It's fun to theorize and contemplate. I wanted to make sure to make mention of a couple places I've mentioned along the way. A resource, konekaonline.org. Yes, I'm a board member, but I'm also an enthusiastic reader of their magazine. I also write for the magazine, and I'd recommend joining Koneka, which is an extraordinary value at how little it is to join. And you get the magazine throughout the year, and you get access to the forum. You get your questions answered when you email Koneka, sometimes by me, and I'm always happy to answer questions about errors. I also made mention, of course, of the Newman Numismatic portal, which if you haven't taken advantage of, please do. It's an inexhaustible resource of information about coins. And as I said at the start, please email me with any questions anytime, minterrors@gmail.com. So with that, I'll open the floor to questions or returning you to your meeting. And thank you so much for the gracious use of your time and listening to me tonight.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah. I noticed that aside from about 5 or 6 19th century coins that you showed, almost all of the coins you showed are late 20th century, and most of them seem to be from the 1970s.
Many were.
So is there any reason why you didn't have other, the coins from other parts of the 20th century?
Great question. What happened was when I was first asked to speak on error coins, I pulled out whatever coins represented planchet, die, and strike that were visually interesting that I could get excited about. And I've got examples from a number of eras. There was let's see, 1937 off center cent in here. There certainly could be other examples of non-modern coins in there because the error examples that I showed, the types of errors, many of them, in fact, if not most or all of them, appear on coins from other eras as well. I mean, you're going to have a hard time finding a rolling fold. You're going to have a hard time finding some of the other error types, but cuds, for example, my gosh, I've got cuds from the 16th century, foreign cuds, right? Or clip planchets occur all throughout the coin making process. So there's there's lots of examples of error coins certainly throughout time, and I could just as easily have picked ones from the 20s, 30s, 40s.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Of course, yeah, great question.
Yeah, great talk.
Thank you. Any other questions, anyone?